Okay, I think we'll get started. Um, so I wanted to welcome everybody to Writing Trauma: From the Holocaust to the Pandemic, Poetry from Immigrant Jewish Writers from the Former Soviet Union, with Luisa Muradian and Julia Kalczynski-Dasbach. So I'm pleased to welcome you here at the University of Washington in Seattle. I am Sasha Senderovich. I'm an assistant professor of Russian studies and Jewish studies at the University of Washington. And it's wonderful to have you in this strange virtual environment that we're all used to by now. I wanted to acknowledge that the University of Washington acknowledges that the Coast Salish people of this land that touches the shared waters of all the tribes and bands within the Duwamish, Puyallup, Suquamish, and Tulalip and the Muckleshoot nations. And I'm really happy to have you with us here for this final Jewish Studies event of the quarter. And also many thanks to the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures for their sponsorship. This talk would not be possible without the amazing group of professionals who work at the Strom Center for Jewish Studies to bring these thought-provoking events of academic events, but also poetry readings, such as what we're doing now. These folks are Sarah Zadis-Rosen, Emily Thompson, Kara Schoonmaker, Lauren Kurland, and Rosa Lastly. So many thanks to them. In order to focus on the presentation, attendees in the Zoom webinar do not have video microphone access today. However, you are all able to ask questions via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And I very much encourage you to submit questions because there will be time for the Q&A at the end, and I will be reading those questions, some of them anyhow, to our participants. And today's event is going to be about 40 minutes, during which the two guests that we're hosting will speak and read from and about their work. And after that, we'll have another 20 or so minutes for the question and answer session, which I will moderate. We have two poets with us today, and I'm going to quickly introduce them, and then I'll say a couple of words about the event, and then I'll turn the floor over to them. Very pleased to welcome Julia Kalczynski-Dasbach, who is the author of 3 collections of poetry, including the Many Names for Mother, which was the winner of the Wick Poetry Prize and came out with Kent State University Press in 2019, and also was a finalist for the 2019 National Jewish Book Award. Don't Touch the Bones, from 2020, which was the winner of the 2019 Idaho Poetry Prize, and forthcoming in 2023, 40 Weeks, an anthology from a collection, of poetry from Yes Yes Books. Her recent poetry appeared in Poetry, American Poetry Review, The Nation, among other publications. She holds an MFA from the University of Oregon, I guess another almost local, a few hours away to the north from us here in Seattle. And Julia just defended her dissertation called Lyric Witness: Intergenerational Recollection of the Holocaust in Contemporary American Poetry, and will be receiving her PhD in Comparative Literature and Literary Theory from the University of Pennsylvania later this year. Luisa Muradian is originally from Ukraine and holds a PhD in poetry from the University of Houston, where she was the recipient of imprint Jesse H. and Mary Gibbs Jones Fellowship and the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences Dissertation Fellowship. She's the author of American Radiance with the University of Nebraska Press, and was the editor-in-chief of Gulf Coast, a journal of literature and fine arts from 2016 to 2018. She was also the recipient of the 2017 Prairie Schooner Prize and the 2016 Donald Bartholomew, I can't say this, a prize in poetry. Apologies. Additionally, Luisa, as well as Julia, is a member of something called the Cheburashka Collective, which is a group of women and non-binary writers from the former Soviet Union. Cheburashka is a beloved unidentified animal, beloved by those of us who were born and grew up in the Soviet Union. And Luisa's previous poems has appeared in 3 Penny Review, the Missouri Review, Coffee House Press, Pleiades, Poetry International, and the Ninth Letter, among other publications. And she lives in Kansas City. So I will send links to poets' websites and their books in the chat once we get started so that you can follow up if you would like. Just a quick word about today's event. We put this on the calendar, months and months ago when I had known the work of both of these poets for some time, but became particularly interested in the poems they were beginning to publish last spring, centered on the pandemic. And they were beginning to come out in various publications, and just really intrigued me. And so we put this on the calendar back in the day. This will be they'll do various things today, but this will be the focus of their conversation with each other, of their reading. And I just find this to be incredibly thought-provoking, but also, emotionally taxing in a good way, in an appropriate way to this moment. They really helped me to think about my own experience, with the lockdown over the course of the past year. And especially, they spoke to me as a fellow child immigrant from the former Soviet Union with, possibly a somewhat related baggage of memories to draw on. And this poetry really brings out some of the traumas of immigration, but also traumas of family history, the questions and the unknowns of family history, as both poets think about themselves, but also about their children and about parenting during the pandemic, parenting young children in the pandemic. So all these questions really come to kind of a provocative point in their work. And I'm just really fascinated by it. And I'm also just sort of pleased to announce that Julia has confirmed to me that they appear to have finished the last poems in that cycle of this year-long project. And we are today the first audience to hear some of this work. So I'm really very excited about this and also nervous. So just a reminder that Q&A, use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to submit questions. You're welcome to submit questions before this talk is over, because if you have a question about a specific poem that you heard and you want to ask it, please do, because it will allow me to kind of take a little longer to process your question and to think about asking it when Q&A comes. So, but for now, I'm just gonna silence myself and turn it over to Luisa and Julia. Welcome to Seattle.
I'm going to begin. Thank you so much for having us. Thank you to the university and the Jewish Center and Slavic and everyone for bringing us. I only wish we could be on the West Coast, but another time, maybe next year. It seems more hopeful. So I'm just going to start by reading one poem from my book, The Many Names for Mother, and then Louise is going to read a couple, and then we're going to go into our project. So this book, The Many Names for Mother, was started out as a project of writing about my immigrant experience, my descent from Holocaust survivors, and these poems kind of weren't coalescing. And they only coalesced once I became pregnant and traveled to the death sites in Poland while 6 months pregnant with my son. And so the poem I wrote about that experience brought my past and my present together. And it's the opening poem of the book. And the only thing to know about it is, I don't know if you'll remember, there was one year that it was very hot in Europe. It feels like now every year is the hottest year in Europe. But this one year, the Museum and Memorial of Auschwitz-Birkenau put up sprinklers at the gates. And this happened right after I returned, like sprinklers to keep people comfortable. So this is Against Naming. Let's not name her or compare flesh to fruit. Let's joke instead how she swallowed a seed and let it grow inside her. Just imagine how heavy is that sound and what it must taste like in ripe summertime heat. I had no cravings though, only wanted to touch the cold or be touched. Polish berries carried winter, so I ate them by the bucket. Gooseberries, currants, sour cherries, bursting childhood in my mouth. A past made sweeter by its being past. My mother sweating through Talkuchka, the little push and shove bazaar, to come home with a stained skirt and fruit dangling from her ears, and me hungry inside her. The Krakow market was a harvest too, the hottest July on record. And in Oświęcim, the camps didn't know what to do with all the people in such heat. So at the gates of Auschwitz, sprinklers appeared, for the children mostly. And you, my love, were just about the size of a heart inside me then, soft and wanting water and a past that isn't this, one not passed down. But I carried you there anyways, carried you against my family's urges, against your future ones, maybe, walked you miles across black ground, turned red, then gray, then left for colorless. The dead around us growing, the ones beneath us silent. And I sang to you of a golden city under a paling sky with its single star and flame-maned lion waiting there. You listened, my love. Perhaps the dead did too. Ashes rising in the creek and in Birkenau's purple wildflowers. Its big book of names from which we did not choose to name you. The Valen, valiant, strong, unmarked by Slavic or first generation or fruit, but V for the survivor who refuse to be named that, for the numbered and unnumbered names unwritten and scattered there, for the woman who made seeds grow as gorgeous out of flesh as out of stone. Thank you.
Thank you, Yulia. That was gorgeous. And thank you, Sasha, for that thoughtful introduction. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you, University of Washington. It's such a gift, as I'm sure most poets would agree, to have anyone listen to your work, and especially to have people spend time with these poems. It's just really lovely. So I'm going to go ahead and jump in. I'm going to read a poem from my book, American Radiance. And the reason I chose this poem, partially because, I write so much about my grandmother, both of them really, and this was a poem that spoke so much to not just the sort of immensity of the loss of the Holocaust, but sort of how that follows survivors like my grandmother into a new country, a new place, and even in her old age, she's still sort of very obsessed with the death, like the burial, all these sort of things. A small side fact, my grandmother's from a small village outside of Odessa in Ukraine. And hers is one of the stories you get often out of Ukraine, where people just disappeared from the village, right? People showed up and just sort of systematically cleared out the village. There's almost no records of what happened to people. She was able to escape with her mother through a forest. Eventually they hopped on a train somewhere and ended up in the mountains. But, for her, eventually years later, when she was able to go home and family and her, including her father, right, these people were it was just gone, as if they had never been there. So that's all the backstory I'm going to give on this poem, but this is for my babushka. Raptor. After the destruction of Jewish cemeteries in Philadelphia and St. Louis. My grandmother wants a bird on her grave, and I say wants, not wanted, because she is still alive, flipping through the Tasteful Tombstones catalog. To be clear, there are 25 different birds you can place on top of yourself when you die. Yes, there are the predictably delicate doves and symbolic sparrows, But my grandmother is interested in something more predatory. The hawk kills with its claws, the falcon mouth first. The marshal will snap a man's arm in half, and a stellar can consume a baby seal. There are 5 types of eagles that will steal your toddler. When they cleared out her village in 1941, my grandmother survived by jumping on a train to the mountains. Her mother and mother's mother buried birdless back in Ukraine. My grandmother now, shaking in her gold cardigan and lifting her arms up toward the Kansas sky, winged raptor, feathered Moses, resurrected and in rage. And then I'm gonna go ahead and read one more just because I always feel like this poem is sort of a good gateway into how the women in my family historically will weave their way into my work. So I'm gonna read this one, which is not in my book. This is a newer poem. So my mother as Tom Cruise. Or as every other late 80s action hero. My mother successfully jumping off of a skyscraper onto another skyscraper. My mother hunting the predator with a cigar lodged in her mouth. My mother saying son of a bitch in the coolest way imaginable. My mother ripping a mask off to reveal she is not, in fact, the president of the United States, but she is, in fact, my mother. My mother somehow knowing how to pilot a helicopter. My mother pulling her abusive father out of a bathtub. My mother slamming her fist down on the table during an arm wrestling tournament. My mother registering her hands as lethal weapons. My mother pleading with her mother to leave before things got dangerous. My mother watching things get dangerous. My mother holding the green wire and the blue wire and figuring out which wire to cut. My mother covered in her mother's blood. My mother, my God, my mother walking away from a burning car. My mother, an action hero that self-destructs, and yet she's still my mother sitting in front of a villain, calmly explaining to him that death is almost here without sharks, without bombs. My mother, pale as the moonlight. My mother watching him die slowly in explosive peace and immeasurable quiet. Now, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our sort of how we got started on the project, and then I'll let Julia actually kick it off with the first poem. But about a year ago, really, we're hitting up to our year anniversary. Julia and I had an event that we were supposed to do together, and she just sort of, we were both. It was like quarantine had really just started, and we were both home with our young kids who are almost like the exact same age. And we were sort of working simultaneously full-time, parenting full-time, and sort of really feeling the anxiety and the fear, especially surrounding the pandemic. And Julia was like, what if, instead of just reading what we always read, what if we just sent each other like every night, because this was like a week out, like we're just gonna send, if we have any brain cells or energy left at all, we're going to send each other a poem. We're just going to write a poem about whatever. And I'm pretty sure like my first or second poem was like about my son having to go potty, right? So this is where like we were at emotionally. But it was kind of like, well, if a few of them work out, maybe we'll read them at the thing. And we had the thing, and we just kept writing. And a year later, we just, it became this sort of thing that we could come to at the end of the night, in this incredibly isolating experience of, it's already isolating being a parent of young children, but to sort of be a parent of young children on top of all these other sort of factors with the sort of the global state happening, it became this thing, sort of one of the things really holding us together. And I don't really know exactly how it, Julia and I have a really shared ancestry, like a really common background between the two of us. And what was so striking to me, not only about, we didn't only sit there and just write about the pandemic, we kept like our grandmothers, grandfathers, parents sort of made their way into the poems so readily. you know, when we sort of started drawing these lines between not just the present moment that we were trying so hard to sort of, you know, get through, but also this sort of shared ancestry and shared history that led its way to the page. So I'm going to let Julia read the first one.
Thanks, Louisa. That's a great intro to exactly what we were doing. And we're going to start and just go through them, but we're going to start with our poem that we wrote on Yom HaShoah. And I think the other thing that really kind of bonded us in our writing is these questions of inheritance, both what we were inheriting from our ancestors and what we were passing down, especially in a time when our kids were surrounded by so much fear and tension already, and we were kind of passing down even more. So this is April 21st, 2020, Yom HaShoah. Dear Louisa, he peed himself twice yesterday, twice today, just steps away from the toilet. He's doing it on purpose, Louisa, I swear. He knows he'll be 5 November 8th. And some days he wants a Black Panther party and other days a Harry Potter one, but always the cake and candle and wish. He has more wishes, Louisa, than hairs I've pulled out of my head with both hands. I always thought this was just an expression, but no, Louisa, it's a mother body's compulsion. After the second pee, I tried to force diapers onto his lanky body, already the size of a schoolboy. He screamed and kicked, "Yani baby, not a baby, not a baby," so I gave up on such punishment, already guilty for even letting my hands try it. But today, after 2 hours of refusals and piss on the floor, and all the threats and promises, all the wishes shattered on the floor in bits of my favorite pastel pink, don't go bacon my heart mug, I shoved Mickey and Pluto pull-ups over his thighs, snug, not painful, and tore my throat, yelling minutes before he fell quietly asleep, while I dug my hands into my head on the stairs, Louisa. This is not complaint. I know you've had such days, and far worse. It's not that bad, we tell ourselves, and hours later, we read poems about our dead ancestors while our children scream in the background, raging against our history already inside them, against an isolation that is the antonym of Jewish family. And I think how my babushka loves to tell me they barely had enough money for underwear after the war, how she had no childhood and still she pities how hard I have it. She wrote me tonight that my Yom HaShoah reading put tears inside her soul. Держись, she said, держись, hold on, be healthy. So I say, Louisa, in our ancestral, unending present tense, our generational imperative, держись, держись, держись. We have so much to hold.
Dear Julia, I can't help but think that my son is the same age as my grandmother, and I am the same age as my great-grandmother when I hold his body tightly and run toward the field of trees behind our yard, and here there are only wild turkeys whirling their strange music in the sunlight, and not a symphony of bullets ripping open bodies of woodland creatures. It's what she remembered, Julia. One moment, a red tail brighter than the burning bush, so bright she was struck by its beauty, and then the world erupted in darkness. By the time they reached the train, everyone on board was dying. The conductor shoveled bodies off the cars as if he was unloading firewood. Another memory, but not as searing as the red tail. She thinks it was a squirrel, maybe something from one of her picture books. Perhaps she imagined it, not yet a writer, but already knowing the importance of beauty as a means of survival. By the time they arrived at the mountains, My great-grandmother had already lost her husband, her mother, her aunts, her brothers. I let my son walk toward the turkeys, and they let him too. No one is afraid here, and the air is golden.
April 22nd, 2020. Dear Louisa, just imagine one day we will ask our children, remember when the world stopped touching? They'll hug us and answer, no.
April 22nd, 2020. Dear Julia, I can't decide what I'm more afraid of. My son barreling across the room to hug strangers, or my son barreling back away from others, permanently terrified of touch.
April 23rd, 2020. Dear Louisa, this is harder than the war, Babushka says. I question her memory. What hard has come to mean almost 30 years past immigration, 75 past famine. I never went hungry, she tells me, remembering their balcony, the length of many communal apartments. Komunalki, a name sounding more like a slur for a woman who loves too eagerly than shared living space. But maybe love is learning how to share a bathroom with strangers who become family. Here, neighbors hoard toilet paper. Here, we struggle to keep family from turning strange. I was eating matzah, she continues. Next, I expect violence, a bloody Jewish nose or torn skirt. A boy tore it out of my hands, she says. He was just that hungry. And I hear pity in her voice, Louisa, as though she would have given him the stale, unrisen crust. This too, I'm not sure I believe. Your prababushka was never touched, she's told me, by any hands she didn't want. And this, Louisa, this I know I don't believe. You see, she worked in kitchens, nights sometimes, serving soldiers, always making sure her children were fed. Oh God, Louisa, if Babushka read this, she'd never forgive me. The mere suggestion of violation, enough. I have to wear a mask, she says, just to walk through the apartment building now. It's so uncomfortable. She hates being touched by anything not of her blood, loves kissing her children's cheeks, grandchildren's necks, and her great grandbaby's pink forehead, teaching her how to bring it ever so gently towards hers. Baran, 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 boots. Ram, 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 boom. Maybe this is where difficulty really comes from. Longing for such slow collision of body. Baran, 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 boots. I bring the baby's head as close as possible to the computer screen and hope this is enough. I beg your mother, come inside, she tells me. But she just brings the groceries and leaves them in the doorway.
April 25th, 2020. Dear Julia, today I made chocolate chip cookies with my son. To date, we have made brownies, khachapuri, pelmeni, vareniki, vanilla cake, and trays full of jello that we never eat but use to bury the bodies of plastic dinosaurs. I can't describe the look on my mother's face when she saw through the screen the game we made of our food. Louisa, food is not a toy. There was so little for so long. Aren't you ashamed? And Julia, yes, I am ashamed. So much shame I cannot undo in the kitchen. Like the cake I had planned to bake for my 16th birthday. The first year I wanted to try making a Napoleon all by myself. I waited all day, dreaming of layers upon layers in my classes. When the bell rang, I ran out to the parking lot and a boy who had pretended to be my friend shoved me into his car and gave me a birthday present. Julia, it was what I told him I always wanted, an easy bake oven, something from my childhood that my parents could never afford. And Julia, It was covered in swastikas, and Julia, he found a doll that looked like me. She had my dark hair, my eyes, my God, he shoved her inside. He must have spent some time forcing her plastic legs through the oven door. Even now, I can't breathe. Even now, I don't know how I got home. I just remember running. I didn't bake for years. I didn't tell my mother why. But here I am watching my son crack an egg in his toddler way. He separates the yolk from the white and beams at me with his new skill. I put my hand on his shoulder, and right now, for at least this moment, the kitchen is quiet.
July 9th, 2020. Dear Louisa, I got the call that my family makes little enough to qualify for medical assistance and food stamp benefits my mother and grandmother worked to get us off of as quickly as possible when we first came here. It's such good news, Babushka said, but you shouldn't make it public. Help, still shameful after 27 years in this country. Help, still something I refuse to ask for. Help, Louisa, still something we refuse, we need.
July 9th, 2020. Dear Julia, when we got our food stamps, my grandfather always made sure that I had something I didn't need. 1 month, a box of chocolate chip cookies, the next, a box of lemon lime soda, and my favorite, a bag of chips with the image of a cowboy riding a potato into the sunset. And it wasn't about the potato, Julia. This was about how I loved that image so much that I washed the bag out when it was empty and kept it as a reminder of beauty.
July 15th. Dear Louisa, I can't stop wondering which one of us it meant will die. Our ancestral certainty that the worst will always come to pass, that nothing passes through the house without leaving bad luck behind or taking parts of us with its departure. Pecks in the wall and scratches on top of the bathroom door. The bird did that, my son reminds, when early morning sun cracks the small window above the kitchen sink where the orchid has been dying for years now, yellowed and unbloomed long before the black bird wormed its way inside to tell us, in these walls, death is as inevitable as light.
July 27th. Dear Julia, Napoleon Bonaparte makes me uncomfortable. Not because he is often made to look bigger than he actually was, but because in this rendering he is smiling while hundreds of men die around him. It has been a week since I've been home, 7 days of sleeping in what was once my grandfather's bedroom. My father's toy soldier collections surround my makeshift bed. As a girl, I knew too much about military strategy and Kutuzov's twisted eye, though now I stare at a picture of myself as a child, holding on to my grandfather as if he might disappear. And he did, Julia. He was here, and now he is not, though I've slept these past nights in his shadows. So many years he met me in front of the bus stop, walking through the forest quietly on our way home. Most days he would wrap a sandwich in a paper towel, and on special occasions there would be a thermos of Lipton tea. It is hard to imagine his hands holding anything but mine, and yet I am reminded of his constant scratching, the shrapnel that he carried in his arms for years, how he whispered, "Some things can never be removed," when I asked why the metal was left behind.
March 11th, 2021. Dear Louisa, on the anniversary of the first case in Philadelphia, it would be too simple, too easy to write, "This has been the shortest, longest year of our lives, and yet it feels monumental, doesn't it, Louisa? Though what will stand except for us to mark this time? Of every figure cast in stone or metal, my son confirms they're dead, right? And begs no figure ever stand of me. Says good night, belly, and good night, neck. Gives each their own farewell as though he could keep the parts of me he's named, the way I keep his stick figure drawings, their arms long enough to knot around so many torsos. This is me hugging Clara and Michaela and Charisma, and you too, Mama, he says. Even after all this distance, conditioned fear of other people's bodies, I have failed to teach him how not to wrap his arms around a stranger. I wish I had some big revelation to share with you tonight. We owe ourselves some lesson, something gained. But I just hear what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, and think, fuck no. And God, I don't say fuck around my children or ever really, but fuck no, Louisa. What doesn't kill you hurts you bad enough. You almost wish you died. Almost. And yet you're here. Say it with me, Mama. We are here, still standing, holding our arms wide for this brief moment, long enough to touch the sun.
March 16. Dear Julia, I am going to start this final poem in the worst way. I'm going to tell you that this year has been impossible, that I cannot write what I cannot remember. So instead, I'm going to make a catalog of images paired with feelings, or maybe a catalog of words paired with meaning. My car is not a vehicle because it has not taken me anywhere this past year. My car is more accurately a movable room built for crying, for parking in the lot of your closest fast food restaurant. You know, the one with the neon lights, where you find moments of comfort, the one with all the other mothers holding on to the warmth of a French fry. We've all been there, that moment of lucid aloneness where the only song on the radio is yourself. And let me be honest, Julia, most days I want that moment in the parking lot so I can look at my children on my phone. In this picture, my older child is smiling with his eyes, his mouth covered with an image of Spider-Man. He holds the hand of his baby brother, now almost a toddler, unmasked, new teeth on display. Their great-grandmother in the same picture behind a screen, wearing the same cerulean sweater she wore on her flight from the Soviet Union all those years ago, exiting the plane, terrified of a new world and yet moving toward my mother's arms that were open, dropping her papers, her suitcase, her fur hat, every physical thing she had carried, all on the floor, everything gone for a moment, for this moment of touch. We're done.
And that's probably the last poem of the book. And you were the first to hear it, everybody. Those are like our last two poems of the book. Pretty excited.
Wow. Thank you so much for this. You couldn't hear me, you couldn't see me at the end because I sort of turned my camera off to listen to, but I was just sort of taking notes and taking it all in, and very thankful to hear these. I'm going to just remind folks to please ask questions via the Q&A button, Q&A function at the bottom. I'm going to be the one to read them. I'll let a few of them come in. I'll ask some questions of my own first, but please send us yours. I mean, several things came to mind as you were talking, and I'll see if I can shape them into a question. You know, this is the pandemic itself is an experience that is now common to us all, right? It's so weird, right? To have lived through something that is common to absolutely everyone that we know, that we don't know, that just everyone. And, you know, like encountering your work pre-pandemic, I was sharing in those parts of the experience that I shared with you and that you share with each other, but also with some other people, right, who are immigrants from the former Soviet Union, who came as children, who write in English, but think in a complex, you know, mush of languages in our heads. And I guess I don't know what the question is. There's something that struck me listening to you now, where I could hear bits and pieces of the Russian, bits and pieces of specifically immigrant woes, you know, the sort of shame over food stamps and, you know, sweaters that you wore on the plane and things like that, that you bring into the experience that is now shared by everyone. And I guess, I don't know, like, what is my question? My question is, how do you, I don't know, how do you see this, well, I don't know what to call it, contribution, this corpus of works, you know, sort of, you know, how do you see it kind of speaking to this pervasive experience? I don't know if I made any sense, but I'm kind of thinking on the spot here.
I'll just say that's a very helpful framing for me because I hadn't thought about it that way. That, you know, Louisa and I write so much into our own kind of personal trauma that is shared, that is a collective trauma of immigration and a collective trauma of Jewishness and of the Holocaust. But now we're all sharing in this collective trauma of the pandemic. And so we're kind of writing, I don't know if it's a bridge between the two, but there's definitely, you know, elisions that we make between the famine and shortages. And I think for me, it always comes from acknowledging my position of privilege, a position that I think is very, is one that's not acknowledged actually by the generations about whom I'm writing. Like they are so traumatized by their past that they in turn just feel like they are continuously traumatized again and again in a very terrible experience, rather than seeing the position of privilege that we are actually in. And that my experience, I in no way think is more traumatic than my grandmother's, but she truly feels this way sometimes in my isolation and the fact that family can't help. In that family is very different in America. I write about that a lot, that these connections, these strong connections forged in the Soviet Union, because family is all we have, so we have to depend on each other. In the US, it's not like that. You can sort of choose to have it or not. I don't know if that made sense, but those were kind of the thoughts I was having.
Yeah, I totally agree with Julia in terms of like sort of constantly considering privilege, especially for those of us that came, you know, as children in the United States like we did, where, you know, you're sort of constantly grappling with that sort of like, oh, hyper awareness of a type of privilege that, you know, our ancestors, our family didn't have, while simultaneously still trying to sort of navigate the world, you know, and deal with sort of your own stuff, your own thing. You know, I think that tension, I've yet to write a poem without that tension, because that's just how my brain operates. Sort of, you know, like I shudder at the thought of complaining about literally anything to my grandmother, because she'll have that empathy. She immediately is like, oh, biedna Louiseczka, like, my goodness, you know, you had to do the dishes. I feel such empathy for you. I'm not grandma, like you know, hid in a mountain for a couple years and had literally nothing, you know, and so that constant sort of, you know, I always think about my grandmother as a sort of women who, the superheroes of empathy, which is always just like, again, something that, and to ways that are both beneficial, but also, you know, ways that I think for their own safety can be dangerous. And it's stuff that I think weaves its way into my work for sure. But in terms of this particular project too, what I wanted to say, I think for a lot of the work I do outside of this project, I'm sort of always navigating how sad I allow myself to be in a poem, because I'm like tremendously sad in poems, right? But I feel like this was like, we're gonna have a sadness party, and we're just gonna invite you to weep with us, which is like the most Soviet thing I can possibly think of, right? Don't ever ask, you know, a Soviet person in an elevator how they're doing, because they will give you an answer and you're not getting out of that elevator ever or anytime soon. So I think this is my take on being in that elevator and somebody asked me how I'm doing during a pandemic. That is this book to me, at least. So I don't even know if I'm answering the question. I'm just gonna mute myself.
No, this is, I think, right. Julia was right, that, you know, I wasn't sure what the question was, like, it sounded like a framing, but what I'm hearing now, and I've read there's a lot of comments that I'm seeing, and so I'm going to try to work in some of the feedback I'm receiving into the next set of questions. And kind of what I heard in what you said, Julia, first was that, you know, kind of well, actually starting with Louisa, right? That this is the most Soviet, this is the most Russian thing, right? The sad party. But there's something also kind of to the contrary, right? And what Julia had said, that so much of the sadness that you reflect on is unacknowledged, right? That the trauma that you write about is pertaining to the experience of your relatives. And, you know, if I may put it as kind of our collective experience, so much of it is unacknowledged trauma, right? And trauma not worked through at all, right? So what's so striking about your work is the naming, right, of what it is that you experience, right, in extremely specific terms, right, and how you, in some ways, provide the language to others of us who have been part of this collective experience in some way, but are maybe not sensitive enough to allow ourselves to dwell in the acknowledging of what happens, right? So so it is the most Russian thing, but also it really isn't, right? So it's like there's that sort of, there's like almost a break, right? That you dwell on this past trauma, and it informs the images in your work. I can't remember, you didn't read this poem today, but I think it was one of the poems that had come out earlier where you were thinking about wearing masks and environment and Chernobyl, right? And because both of you were born in Ukraine fairly close to the time of the explosion, etc. So, right, so that kind of thing that is so specifically historic and traumatic, but you work it in. So let me try to ask some questions that people are asking. I'm going to group a few into, there were several, first on, many people are just thanking you for this reading and for how touching it was and thought-provoking and emotional to many people. There were several questions that were wondering specifically about parenting and how the experience you described is so, the motherhood, the parenthood, and specifically motherhood, right, amplifies the sense of isolation in the pandemic. Something that is already, at least in our culture, right, is sort of the way that the economics and the sociality of motherhood often works is already an isolating experience. On top of this, there's the pandemic. So I don't know if you wanted to think about that as well now.
I think maybe I'll just start, if we're talking about isolation and motherhood, I think that was kind of the genesis of this project. And Louisa said it's like, it's our pity party on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's like what I would want to say to every mama, but I get to say it to Louisa, so I get to be more intimate. And there's this saying about, poetry is we're writing to be overheard. So the form of the letter makes us like we're writing to be heard. And there's an intimacy and a transparency and, almost like a freedom, but at the same time, something very scary because there's nothing to hide behind, because these poems are very directed. But it for me, that was the break out of isolation, because I always had a mama who was going to listen to me and who was going to echo back my experience.
Yeah, I think that's the best way to describe it for sure. It's, you know, parenting is incredibly isolating, but then also like add the layer of literal isolation because of the quarantines and the pandemic. And, you know, I just remember, you know, having these days where I just felt like I hadn't, you know, you just don't even, you can't even process it. So for me, it was always that point that, no, I really tried. There were like a lot of these poems, like if we were to timestamp them, like 1:30 in the morning, midnight. I think we have a series of poems that are sent by our, probably, I think I remember writing mine on the phone because I had had a newborn too, right around this time. So I'm like, you know, up 3 or 4 times a night anyway to feed the baby. And I'm just sitting there holding him and it's like 3, I'm like, I can't get him to burp. Like, it's just like, you know, like little, like these really physical things, but just having, because like I knew there was a good chance Julia was also going to be awake because her kids are similar ages. So I'm like, hey, I know Remy's cutting teeth this week. I bet Julia's up right now. And like minutes later, I get a response from Julia, right? So it very much did feel like having just someone there to sort of like on the mother level too, right? To sort of have that moment of connectivity with that's outside of the house in a totally different place geographically, but yet that was still sort of like having that parent moment. And also kind of like what Julia said, there's so many things, especially about motherhood or even parenting, that I wish people had been more open about. And like things that I still to this day feel like we're sort of hesitant to talk about, right? We're so worried that you know, we're sort of not going to be perceived in a certain, whatever the stamp of what, you know, that journey should look like. And especially it's this year has really taught me in terms of like, I have 2, you know, young children. I'm like, how do I want them to think of me? And I don't want them to see me as this sort of like selfless, perfect maternal figure that is constantly making them, you know, buterbrodiki and just like, here you go. What do you need? You know, because I don't know if that's healthy either, right? I want them to see days where mom's having it rough, or days where mom's mom needs to go do some writing, or you know, like this sort of like teaching of not mother as mother, but also mother as human being, because those lines so often get blurred. And I know for me, especially during the early months of the pandemic, I was, you know, body in clothing, maybe awake, moving and getting snacks and changing diapers and those sorts of things, but not having human thoughts. I'm just gonna stop talking.
This is very, you know, to me, obviously, you know, we have a 2.5-year-old, but I'm not a mother. I you know, the child has a mother, and you know, the mother is the child is my partner. But I've noticed, right, the way that even just the tendency to interact is really differs between the two of us. I'm more inclined to be yielding. And she not maybe thinking what you just said, Louisa, right? Is that the you know, you don't want to create this impression that you are for the child, right? That you're always available to satisfy their every need, because it's already so impossible to think about yourself, right? So just I'm sort of aware, and I'm thinking about the, you know, short stories of Grace Bailey, for example, who writes about, you know, immigrants in New York who were parents in the 1920s, right? Immigrants like our parents were immigrants, but 100 years ago, right? Where the relationship between mothers and children is so much tougher than the relationship between fathers and children, because fathers are somehow, you know, have this leisure to, they interact with their children at leisure much more than the mothers do, having to spend time with them at home. And the pandemic kind of shut everyone down in this circumstance, no matter where people had worked and how they made their kind of space and time outside the house, all in one place. So I can hear this very well in what you're saying. A question, I mean, you kind of about politics from somebody who is a participant. I'm just going to read it. somebody whose name was Valeria. I don't know who this is. I was struck by the description of Babushka saying that the pandemic was harder than anything she survived in the USSR. I often hear my Jewish relatives from the former Soviet Union wax poetic about the positive nature of capitalism in the United States without the critique of the economic exploitation that comes with that, or about the merits of Israel without the critique of occupation, and so on. How do you see this former Soviet Union Jewish trauma as a force behind our relatives' political consciousness? And how can we metabolize that trauma towards some sense of, the person uses the word justice, right? I'm going to kind of editorialize and think about towards, merits of, improving the world in some way.
I think that's it's a very hard question, because I think I personally forgive forgive my parents their non-recognition most of the time, and my grandparents, because it comes from a place of trauma that they don't recognize. So the things that they don't see about the exploitation of capitalism is because they were so traumatized by not having anything. And the things that they don't see about the occupation, Israeli occupation, is because they hold on to Israel as this one thing that validates them as Jews, for whatever the reason is. I don't condone it, but I forgive it. And I think in my poems, I'm writing through all of those things, particularly with the election, this lack of recognition, or this terrible fear of socialism, and the way that democracy, right, and the Democratic Party is touted as socialist, this fear of what that means, again, because of trauma, but at the same time being like, oh, but we should all have healthcare, right? Because they want all the things from socialism without recognizing the baggage. But yeah, I just think for me, it's accept that it's someone who is working through a lot of trauma, and look at the positive, look at the empathy and the light that they bring, and the love. And I'm not sure I'm the one that can reconcile it for either myself or for them, but I write through it.
Yeah, I think, Julie, I love the way you frame that. Yeah, I have a very similar a relationship to that, I would say. And I think, the sort of level of trauma, like every so often my parents will casually name a story, and I'm just like, wait, what happened to you? And then they'll just be like, no, it's fine. My mother was openly slapped in school for saying something too Jewish, right? And I'm just like, wait, what happened to you? And she's just like, I mean, it's fine, and so I sort of, some of those positions I don't always agree with, but then, and we have different experiences. Like Julie and I are joke, we're almost the same person, but I will say too, maybe, we came to the Midwest where we had so little community that we were able to connect with. So in some ways, my parents did experience firsthand some of the issues we do face here, especially having a, really high risk father. My father's had all sorts of health and medical issues. And so, remembering very vividly the sort of issues of being essentially uninsurable for so long. And my dad to date still has a really tough job that he's never been able to leave, never been able to pursue, education in the United States because he's been tied to his insurance. And so, recognizing some of those dire needs of medicine and things like that, I think has, in some ways altered my parents. But again, that took a really personal stake in really working through certain things for my parents. And like I said, I agree with you. I don't think it's my ability to sort of reconcile that for them, or for you know what I mean, or to even really necessarily reshape that for them or anything like that. And I hesitate to even really speak to for my parents on certain political issues, because they're actually not always in agreement. So I'm like, what would my mother say on that? And so I would say, I think for us, writing and raising our next generation, and and doing what we can on our own front is all that we can sort of speak for ourselves. Like I can't, speak for Babushka Fanya and give her sort of political leanings or things like that. I think as a community, we can do our best to sort of have that conversation, but on the personal level, I don't know what I can say for my grandmother, at least.
So a couple of I'm trying to thank you for this answer. I mean, this is something that I think about constantly myself too. So that question from somebody in the audience resonated with me as well. First of all, there's this comment that's kind of resonates with me. It's just a comment. Thank you for not traumatizing others by being brutally positive in a time of confusion and near despair, right? Which does to me strike me. This is a very kind of Russian attitude, right? That all of this kind of positive inclination in American culture, especially I think in the beginning of the pandemic, right, where people sort of assumed, a couple of weeks, right? It'll be over, or like the vaccines are just around the corner. So I'm going to turn it into a question, I guess, and try to think, ask you, how does it feel to dwell in the brutality of the honesty as opposed to the, a kind of saccharine hope, maybe. Is hope overrated?
I will say really quickly, because this made me think, we didn't read it, but I have one short little poem in the book that's like, if I see one more Pinterest meme about cherishing these magic moments, I'm going to burn it all down with kerosene. Like, it's like, I could not see, especially in those first couple of months. Because like, eventually we all broke, right? Like a few people gave it a good run, but it was like, oh, today, like my kids and I, we're just gonna do yoga and like, connect with nature. And I'm like, are you though? And I think it's just so unhealthy sometimes. Like, I think it was, yeah, for me at least, it was that moment of like, it's not healthy for me to sort of only expect this sort of overwhelming joy or happiness, because that is wildly important. But those moments during the pandemic felt like they were there, but they were so often against this like snapshot or background of sort of like constantly navigating fear and and worry, and also again just like raising such young children and trying to explain overnight. And I don't know what you guys can speak to your experience too, but like overnight going from we can't go to story time at the library anymore. Okay, why? Oh, we can't go to the park anymore. Oh, we can't, like your neighbor friend, like, sorry, like we're not going to see them for months. Like you can maybe wave at them from the yard, right? And it's just like, but like you can't be like, oh, here's what a pandemic is, 2.5-year-old, and like, are you registering this? Because they're just like, what is that? What's going on? And so watching our children sort of react to the world in very like normal ways that young children would react. And I think if I had really pushed back super hard on that and tried to sort of mimic normalcy, I think that would have been in some ways even, worse, because it just wasn't gonna work for me. I mean, and let Julia talk about that too.
Well, and I'll also say we, like, you said we all broke at about the same time, I think, at least like in my area of moms, like everyone was like, I'm not seeing my parents, I'm never seeing them. And then around June, we'd all stayed inside, and around June, those who had no help in there, we were like, well, it's time to see my parents, because otherwise I might lose my mind. Like I have nobody to help me. And we have poems in the book about that. And I had like browsed the question in the chat about editing and things like that. And these are for the most part unedited. Like some we would go back but we decided that we wanted to stay true to the nature of how they were written. And oftentimes, like, I remember we tried to edit and then I was like, nope, put it back. Like there's something about the way that it was written and the fury in which it was written and the that I don't remember that it was written. Like truly, whenever we read these poems back, like I just love hearing Louisa read her poems because I remember, but I don't remember. I love reading my own poems from this project more than anything else because every time I read, I'm like, oh, I really genuinely don't remember writing that line or that moment happening because, you know, there was pee on the floor and so many other things.
Yeah, Julia sent me a message yesterday. We're like deciding what we were gonna read today, and Julia's like, "Oh, I just love your butterflies poem," and I'm like, "I wrote a butterfly poem." I'm like, "That, like the Mariah Carey album, or like actual butterflies?" Like I'm like Googling in the document, like where is this? So, I did in fact write a butterfly poem that I had no memory of because things were crazy.
Yeah, thanks for also talking about the edit. 'Cause there are many questions, as Julia mentioned, about the kind of your process and editing, and you know, I think you've several people. So I'm not going to call on specific questions because I think that this comment kind of addressed quite a few of them. But I wanted to kind of, there are a few more that stuck with me from the questions. So there's one that was sort of asking from Olga Zilberbrook, who is also a writer in San Francisco. Asking, did you feel that your writing changed over time through this project? I mean, you just talked about the constant sort of barrage of it, right? But maybe kind of now in retrospect, if you feel that there's some moments that you're sort of writing about the subject changed, and what might have been some of the biggest surprises that your poems held for each of you. And someone else was asking earlier, you know, how, you know, were you reacting? I mean, we could hear it in some of the poems that you read, that you were specifically reacting to images. But I guess, what were you surprised by any ones in particular that stick with you?
Yeah, I think for me, I'm someone who tends to really layer, especially something that if I'm writing towards something that's trauma based, I really layer and try to give myself as much way to back out as I possibly can. Just you know, I do that often with humor. I do that often with Arnold Schwarzenegger and all sorts of like 90s action movie iconography. As I read one of my poems, one of my many poems that does that. I think for me, there's that space is a space of comfort. So writing in this letter format, writing to someone I know so well, did sort of by nature allow me to sort of be more open and raw. And there are moments where you know, we'd like write something and like we'd like text each other like, I don't know if I could publish that. Like let's just like leave it and then we'll revisit that. You know, to sort of like decide how. So I guess for me, it's being more open. But I mean, partially too, that's, you know, the only writing I was really able, for the most part, the only writing I was able to do this past year, just based on not having time, was to one person, right? So it's like you're listening into a year-long conversation. And that just by default, I think, opens up details, right? There's moments where I'm just like, I don't know what else to say other than like, you know what I mean, Julia? Like I say that in like the middle of a poem because I'm like, I know Julia knows what I mean. So whoever's reading it is going to be like, well, Julia knows what's going on. Whether the reader knows that or not, I'm not sure. But like at that moment, I'm like, Julia, the thing is, it's in the poem, right? Like, so yeah.
Well, and we have a poem in the works that we may or may not include in the book that's literally taken from our text messages, because so, you know, you might think like we have so much in common that we really know each other. We do, but we've only met twice. No, three times. Because we met through poetry. We met through the Cheburashka Collective, through writing, for being, you know, post-Soviet writers, and then reading each other's work and loving it and being like, wow, we're the same person. We both have a great grandmother, Vera. Like the similarities are.
I think you like came to America like a week after I did, like something like crazy like that, like where our immigration bursaries are.
Ours is the 17th.
Yes, ours is the 20th.
No, the 13th. The 13th. Close enough. But yes, our immigration bursary. Yeah. So I had something else that I was like, I really wanted. I wanted to talk about how much I've learned from Louisa, because that is one of, just for me, the biggest gift. In the first poem that I write to Louisa, I tell her that I wish I had her gift for jokes and baking. And I do. Like, I wish that I could bake, but I also wish that I could be funny in poems. And I think through reading so much of Louisa's work and through letting myself be more free, I've gotten like a little lighter in my poems and a little more able to let in those pop culture elements that I just never let in my work before, because like I'm a hoot in life, but I'm very serious on the page. And Louisa helped me let in all of those things. And, you know, having kids that destroy things also helps let in more of that destruction and chaos. But that's for me been, I don't know, one of the biggest joys of the project is learning from writing to one another. And most of the time when we're responding to each other's images, I don't know if it's even always conscious. Like I think when I read back through the poems, there's so many linkages between them that aren't orchestrated. Like we wish we could tell you we planned it all, but we didn't.
We're not that good. We're really not that good, actually.
Yeah, that's just what happened.
We might reframe that for later conversations, but at this stage, we're just not that.
Yeah, so I'll just ask one more question. I'll combine a couple of different things into a question from the members of the audience. So someone, and that's something I thought about myself too. So someone points out that somebody who had recently taken a course on Holocaust and the intergenerational trauma, right? And the kind of the nature of the trauma of people who, you know, inherit the trauma that they themselves have not experienced, but inherited secondhand from grandparents or parents. And, you know, the sort of complexity with thinking with your work about the children about whom you're writing and their inheritance of the trauma, as, you know, for those of them who are a little older in a conscious way, for those of them who are younger in a less conscious way, and the layering of this trauma of the pandemic on whatever they'll inherit of the historical trauma that came before the pandemic, right? So just sort of thinking about that is so just mind-boggling and taxing. And, you know, someone else asks a question that I think arises maybe out of that recognition. Someone who notes that they were trembling hearing you read as granddaughter of grandparents who were killed before this person was born, and that their parents were in a war camp in Siberia where she was born, or they were born. I don't know who the person is, the gender of the person. And the question was, from that kind of experience, you know, how did you feel the first time you read to total strangers, especially about this kind of subject?
I guess I can start. So I feel like I've been writing about kind of my great grandmother's legacy since I started writing. That was my first poem in my MFA program. It was a long, long sequence, and I had never until then written about it. So for me, it felt like my first way of being able to talk about it. And I do get very emotional reading. I think Louisa does too. I think it's sometimes it's like I don't even realize which poem's gonna like hit me really hard as I'm reading it, but then it does, and I don't know what happens. So yeah, I think, I don't know if it's a good answer, but it's something that I can't not write about. And I think that's part of these poems, is that even as we're writing about our screaming children right now, we can't help but write about all the other things that screaming child reminds us of. You know, I have a poem in my first book about looking at a construction site and my son like loving it and being like, wow, this is the best thing I've ever seen. And all I can see is Babi Yar and the place where my great grandfather would be, but we don't have a record of it. And that's every construction site. I always see it, I feel it. And I don't know I think I'm grateful that our children will not. But at the same time, I hope that they will know about it, even if they don't feel it as bodily as we do.
Yeah, it's always a little terrifying for me, especially with those more personal poems that I can't necessarily wrap in as many jokes, right? And sometimes the more horrifying the subject matter, the more jokes I sort of front load in there because I can't get there without some humor as a survival mechanism for me at least. Um, I actually, I don't know how many times I actually, the first poems I ever wrote, I was young, I was a kid. I would have these horrible nightmares about being consumed by the floor because I thought I was being buried alive, which is something that happened to my great grandmother and the Jewish people in the village. They like took them out. This is what they learned later from neighbors. Like they took them out, had them like bury a pit, and then jump in, and then they just buried. Some of them were buried alive. Some of them were shot dead. That's what happened to them. And not specifically Babi Yar. This happened in outside of Khorasan, but they, I don't remember my parents ever sitting me down and telling me this. Right, I'm like 7 when I'm having these really horrifying dreams, and my parents like take me to a doctor. They're like, "What do we do with her? Like, she's not sleeping. Like, we're really worried because I'm little." And they like finally landed on, my mother saw like a creative writing camp advertisement, and so she sent me. And I wrote my first poem, and I was like immediately like came home and went to bed. Like it was like this like click of like I found my way to access and walk through that. And so I don't know what I want for my children in terms of like I want them to be responsible human beings and be aware of their background and what they come from. But I don't want them having horrifying nightmares when they're 7, right? I don't. What I do want for them too is to have methods or ways to, if whenever they do, are greeted with the difficult, the horrible truths that do exist in the world, right? That they are able to find some way, whether that's through jokes, whether that's through writing. I don't know what it's going to be for them. That there's like all we can really equip them for is to find a way to grapple with that on their own terms. For me, it's writing, it's cheesy jokes, it's lots of baked goods. I don't know what it's going to be for my kids. My son does love to bake, though. For like a 3-year-old, it's kind of amazing. He's pretty good, I gotta say. Pretty proud of him.
If I can just say, like, I kind of hate that we're stopping the project. Who knows? I joked with Louisa. I'm like, this book is when the world stopped touching. The next one is the world started touching. And Julie and Louisa are still writing poems about now the touching. But I can't believe we've never talked about the fact that I had terrible dreams as a kid too, and was taken to a voodoo doctor when I was 5. And then the voodoo lady said that I was a bad person in my past life. And that's why I'm being haunted by these dreams.
So maybe that's what I'll do with my kids. I don't know. You're giving me so many ideas.
Yeah, I mean, just tell that's what you should
pour some wax in a bowl and then see what it says.
Yeah. But so see, we haven't even written a poem about that. How can we stop writing? We need to write about our dreams, and there's definitely not enough about our dads. There's so much.
Oh my gosh, I mean, thank you both so much. I mean, this is so rich. I hope that someone in the chat had noted that they hoped that this would be a book that we could get and hold. I don't know if you already know if that's the case or not, but I hope that that's the case.
We hope it will be. We don't have any certainties, but we are working on that being the case.
If we have to turn it into a PowerPoint, we will.
No, but really, thank you so much for just to even, I mean, and thank you to everyone for their questions. I'm sorry that I didn't get to ask, but we got to a few, or at least the spirit of a number of them that were voiced, because many of us who were here today really found themselves kind of thankful and for all of the thought-provoking work that you shared. And I hope that this will be a book that we can hold and sit with and, think about as hopefully this experience recedes into the background and, we stop touching again and are not that scared of that experience as you suggested we might. So thank you both for being here. Thank you to everyone for coming. I wanted to ask all the attendees to save the dates for the Strom Center lectures, which is being announced right now, for reading Jewish texts in the age of climate change with Julia Watts-Belzer of Georgetown University. And this is our annual big lecture that has been happening at the University of Washington for a few decades, actually. So please do attend. And we hope to see you again at our events. Thank you.